Dreams contain images and associations that are not created by conscious intention. They reveal a psychic activity beyond our will. What the real fear is not knowing who you are, but finally seeing yourself. Most people believe they're searching for truth, but what they really want is a reflection they can tolerate. They study Jung, talk about shadow, persona, archetypes, individuation, yet they keep running from the same moment, the one where the mirror stops being theory and becomes confrontation. The more we talk about self-knowledge, the more refined our escapes become. We turn psychology into armor, study into distraction, and the language of the soul into a collection of concepts that keep us from feeling the impact of what we truly are. Picture a mirror covered in dust, abandoned in a forgotten room. Every new book, every spiritual insight, blows off a little more of that dust. People analyze the frame, the glass, the meaning of reflection, but almost no one dares to look inside. It's easier to study the mirror than to meet the eyes staring back. It's safer to talk about the shadow than to feel it. Because seeing yourself isn't an intellectual act. It's visceral, raw, sometimes unbearable. The mind can understand Jung, but the heart must live him. And living Jung means letting the unconscious speak. Not through words, but through symptoms, dreams, failures, and repeating patterns that keep teaching what the intellect refuses to learn. When Jung spoke of individuation, he wasn't describing a path toward perfection, but a conscious descent. The art of facing your own fragmentation until opposites reveal their unity. But the ego fears that descent. It wants to understand without changing, to interpret the symbol without being touched by it. So the student becomes trapped in knowledge, the seeker lost in seeking, while the mirror remains covered, filled with theories, empty of presence. To look within is an act of courage because there's no guarantee what you'll find. The image can be radiant or monstrous. Inside each of us lives an exile, rejected parts waiting to be recognized. Jung wrote in the ego and the unconscious. Everything that a man has not confronted in himself will be reflected in his fate as an event. As long as we refuse to clean the mirror, life will do it for us, and usually with a firm hand. Crises, losses, and repeating cycles aren't punishments. They're invitations to see what the mind hides. The mirror of the soul isn't polished by understanding, but by surrender. Only when knowledge bows to experience does the true image emerge. And maybe that's why so many turn away. Because to discover yourself isn't a triumph, it's a surrender. The question that remains is simple, yet immense. What exactly does a mirror reflect when we finally dare to look? Imagine a man who spends years studying psychology, absorbed in Jung's works, convinced that understanding the soul equals transformation. He knows every archetype, every mechanism of the mind. Yet one night, he dreams he's walking through a dark room, holding a lantern. As he turns, the light flashes across a cracked mirror, and he sees his own face, twisted, broken, unrecognizable. The unconscious, patient and impersonal, simply returned what reason had tried to erase. The next morning, he realizes the truth. You can study the demons of the mind, but that doesn't mean you've made peace with your own. Jung taught that the unconscious isn't the opposite of reason, but its complement. The shadow forms exactly where the ego believes it is light. The problem isn't knowing too much. It's using knowledge as a shield against truth. The ego expands in its effort to comprehend, but every step toward clarity casts a deeper shadow behind it. The brighter the light, the darker the contrast. This is a law of psychic compensation. Every increase in consciousness creates its own shadow. Ignoring it doesn't erase it. It only grants autonomy. That's the paradox of inner work. The more you chase the light, the more you must learn to walk with the dark. The shadow isn't an enemy. It's a reverse mirror. It holds everything you refuse to be. The impulses, the grief, the jealousy, the rage, the tenderness you judged as weakness. Jung wrote that the unconscious behaves in a compensatory way toward the conscious attitude. When the rational self grows inflated, the unconscious answers with images of collapse, failure, and humility. It doesn't punish. It restores balance. The scholar's lantern represents reason trying to dominate mystery. But the psyche isn't a lab. It's a living forest, ancient and unpredictable. When you shine the light too directly, it defends itself, and the brilliance starts to blind you. That's why so many lose themselves in intellectual spirituality. They talk about the unconscious, but can't bear to feel it. They want to heal without bleeding, understand without feeling, be reborn without dying. Jung reminded us that all knowledge of the psyche is lived, not merely understood. The mind that observes without participation becomes sterile, detached from the soul. Real self-knowledge begins when the lantern flickers out, and you must walk by intuition, not by intellect. Then you realize the darkness you feared in the room was always inside you. The ego believes it's the observer, but it's the one being observed. The shadow isn't the monster hiding in the corner. It's the gaze watching from within. And so the question arises, haunting and inevitable, what happens when the unconscious decides to react against the overexposure of reason? There's a reason mirrors crack when you stare too long. The unconscious doesn't like being dissected. It resists control not out of malice, but out of balance. It's alive, an autonomous force that doesn't bow to intellect or logic. Jung wrote, "Dreams contain images and associations that are not created by conscious intention. They reveal a psychic activity beyond our will." The ego and the unconscious, page 206. This is a forgotten truth. The psyche has its own will, its own rhythm, its own intelligence. When consciousness grows arrogant, when the mind insists on knowing instead of listening, the unconscious pushes back and always finds a way to speak, even if that voice comes disguised as chaos. You might feel it as anxiety that grows stronger the more you analyze yourself. You think you're becoming more aware, but your body trembles at night, your chest tightens for no reason, and sleep feels heavy with symbols. You start dreaming of mirrors that crack when you look into them, faces half lit and half hidden, doors that lead to rooms you've never seen before. These aren't random images, they're messages. The unconscious is compensating for the one-sidedness of your awareness. When the rational mind dominates too long, the inner world fights to restore equilibrium. This is a law of psychic compensation. For every conscious attitude, the unconscious generates its counterforce. If you over-identify with light, the dark will rise to balance you. If you repress anger in pursuit of serenity, it returns as self-doubt or exhaustion. If you chase control, the psyche will invent confusion to humble you. The more the ego tightens its grip, the more the soul slips through its fingers. That's why no amount of positive affirmations, theories, or meditations can silence the deeper movement of the psyche. It isn't asking to be fixed, it's asking to be heard. When the unconscious defends itself, it speaks through symbols. It sends dreams, synchronicities, slips of the tongue, illnesses, and subtle resistances. Each one is a form of communication, not punishment, but correction. It's the mirror shattering under the pressure of excessive scrutiny, reminding you that mystery cannot be domesticated. The moment you start treating your psyche as an object to study rather than a living mystery, it retreats into paradox and contradiction. Jung observed that the more you try to dominate the inner world, the more it becomes elusive, wrapping itself in metaphor, so that only humility can approach it. The person who studies their dreams but never lives them, who understands the theory but never kneels before experience, eventually reaches a breaking point. The dreams grow louder, the patterns repeat more painfully, until something inside finally says, "Stop pretending you're in control," because the unconscious doesn't obey commands. It waits for surrender, and when it's ignored for too long, it stops whispering and starts shaking the foundations of your life. The mirror has cracked now, and its reflection is fragmented into truths you can't yet comprehend. But what happens when someone refuses to listen to that return and keeps trying to control the mystery? There comes a point when knowledge stops liberating you and starts protecting you. What began as a search for truth becomes a fortress made of ideas. You don't feel anymore, you analyze your feelings. You don't grieve, you interpret grief. Every emotion becomes an object to study, every pain a pattern to decode. You build a library around your wounds, and in that sacred silence of intellect, you've mistaken observation for transformation. Jung warned about this moment, when understanding replaces experience, when consciousness inflates beyond its natural size and begins to believe it is the totality of the psyche. This is what he called the inflation of consciousness. The ego, dazzled by its own light, starts to believe it has merged with the self, the divine center of the soul. It begins to think, I am awakened. I see what others can't. I've transcended. But this is not awakening. It's intoxication. The more the ego identifies with the self, the more it drifts from the humble center of humanity. And the symptoms are always the same. Loneliness that feels like altitude, exhaustion disguised as enlightenment, and a subtle arrogance that says, I've already faced my shadow. Imagine the scholar still sitting in his room, surrounded by shelves that used to comfort him. The books now seem to stare back, their spines like closed eyes. The room once filled with curiosity now feels like a labyrinth, corridors of ideas with no exit. Every path loops back to himself. The air grows heavy. The lantern he once carried flickers, and the silence begins to whisper. You've learned everything except how to be human. The library turns into a cell. The words that once freed him now echo like prayers without faith. Knowledge has become the wall between him and life. This is the cost of a mind that refuses to kneel before mystery. When consciousness becomes inflated, it forgets that it was born from the unconscious, the vast ocean beneath reason. The ego becomes too proud to admit it's still learning, still small, still vulnerable. And so the soul withdraws. Emptiness follows achievement. Certainty replaces wonder. The seeker who once chased meaning now stares into his own intellect, and all he finds is reflection. No depth, no movement, just the cold brilliance of self-analysis. But Jung didn't see the mirror as punishment. He saw it as a portal. When the image of yourself begins to crumble under the weight of too much knowledge, it's not the end, it's an invitation. The cracks in the mirror aren't there to shame you. They're doors to the unconscious, paths back to humility, back to feeling, back to the living mystery of being. So the question is no longer why the mirror broke, but something far more daring. How we step through it without losing ourselves inside. The mirror no longer reflects. It opens. Where once there was only distortion, now a doorway of light begins to shimmer. This is a moment Jung called the turning inward, when a work stops being about what's wrong with you and begins to reveal what's waiting to be born. The Jungian path isn't about elimination, it's about integration. We're not here to kill the shadow, but to listen to it until it reveals its gift. Individuation, the journey toward wholeness, doesn't demand perfection. It asks for honesty. The first step is recognition. You admit that there are parts of you you've never truly met. Maybe it's the anger you've buried under kindness, the sadness behind your laughter, or the need for control masquerading as strength. Recognition is painful because it strips away your illusions of who you think you are. But in that moment of raw honesty, the soul exhales. It's been waiting to be seen. Then comes acceptance. This isn't resignation, it's reverence. Acceptance means sitting with what you find without judgment or justification. It's listening to your inner contradictions and realizing they're not your enemies. They're your teachers. Jung once described this stage through the idea of the transcendent function, the living dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious that gives birth to a new attitude. When you stop fighting the opposites within you, something mysterious begins to emerge between them. A bridge, a new language of the soul. Next is integration. This is where insight becomes embodiment. You begin to act from what you've discovered instead of hiding it behind understanding. You practice patience when you'd usually flee. Speak truth when silence feels safer. Forgive yourself when the old voice demands punishment. Each small act of integration anchors the unconscious into the world of the living. You stop seeking wholeness as a destination and start living it as a process. Finally, there is service. When you face your own depths, compassion becomes instinct. The knowledge you once hoarded turns into presence, something that heals not by instruction, but by example. The individuated person doesn't preach light. They embody it quietly, like a candle that doesn't fight the dark, but transforms it by existing. In Jung's words from the structure and dynamics of the psyche, the meeting of two opposing forces always creates a third, something greater than either. That third thing is consciousness renewed, an awareness born from dialogue, not domination. The mirror now stands open, filled with light that doesn't blind but reveals. You sense that transformation isn't about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who's been behind the glass all along. Yet even at the sacred threshold, there's a subtle danger. Because just beyond the light of integration lies a shadow more seductive than fear itself. A force that looks like enlightenment but binds like illusion. What happens when the very light meant to free you becomes your new prison? There's a kind of light that doesn't guide. It blinds. It shines so intensely that it convinces you the journey is over, that you've arrived. This is a light of spiritual inflation, the false dawn that appears just before true illumination. Jung warned that the greatest dangers on the path to consciousness aren't in the darkness, but in the light we mistake for truth. The lamp that was meant to reveal begins to glare. Its brightness becomes arrogance. Its warmth turns into isolation. These are the traps of the light, subtle, seductive illusions that turn growth into ego. The first trap is spiritual ego inflation. It begins when knowledge turns into identity. You start to believe you're above ordinary emotions, anger, jealousy, fear, and you judge others who still wrestle with them. You talk about consciousness, but secretly crave superiority. The ego hides behind transcendence, whispering, "You've evolved beyond this." But as Jung observed, every claim of superiority is a confession of oppression. The higher the persona climbs, the deeper the shadow sinks. True wisdom doesn't exalt, it humbles. The second is narcissistic isolation. Here, the seeker mistakes solitude for enlightenment. Introspection becomes an escape from life rather than a dialogue with it. The world feels heavy, messy, too human. So you retreat into theories, mantras, and inner spaces that ask nothing of you. But the psyche isn't healed in exile. It's healed in contact. The soul thrives not in separation, but in relationship, with people, with pain, with imperfection. Light without connection becomes sterile. Then comes the savior complex. The wounded healer who tries to fix everyone else so they don't have to face their own unhealed heart. They become addicted to helping, projecting their ignored suffering onto others. Jung saw this as one of the most insidious shadows of the empathic spirit. To save others without confronting your own wounds is to build temples on unstable ground. The most transformative healers are those who no longer need to be needed. The fourth trap is regression into unconsciousness. This one comes disguised as peace. After so much struggle, the mind longs for rest and accepts easy answers, dogmas, spiritual cliches, borrowed beliefs. You trade the living fire of inquiry for the comfort of certainty. But certainty is just another mask for fear. The path asks, not for perfection, but persistence. To keep walking even when the light flickers, even when the mystery grows silent. Between Nietzsche's call to become the Übermensch, the self-exalting hero, and Meister Eckhart's invitation to surrender completely to the divine within, Jung found a middle way, to become what you are, not more than human, not less, fully, courageously human. The goal isn't to rise above life, but to meet it, embody it, and love enough to transform through it. Individuation isn't ascent into heaven or a descent into hell. It's the realization that both are within you. And so, after the glare fades and the false lights burn out, something quieter remains. A clear, steady glow that neither blinds nor flatters. It is the soul's own light, gentle, unwavering, real. You cross through mirrors, shadows, and illusions. Now, only one question remains. When you walk through every layer of darkness and light, what does the mirror finally reveal? In the end, the mirror stops being a battlefield. Its cracks no longer distort your face. They let the light in. What once reflected confusion now reveals a quiet vastness. The self you spent a lifetime defending begins to dissolve into something larger, something infinitely alive. You no longer look into the glass searching for identity. You look through it and see the sky. The mirror that once imprisoned you now opens like a window to the divine within all things. No longer the seeker, no longer the scholar. You stand as a witness of your own becoming. The labels, the theories, the spiritual postures fall away, and what remains is disarmingly simple. Presence. You feel the pulse of the world in your own heartbeat. You realize that awareness was never meant to isolate you. It was meant to connect you to every wound, every soul, every shimmering fragment of life. The path of Jung was never about transcendence, but incarnation, to bring consciousness down into the mud and miracle of being human. In that stillness, you see that the shadow was never your enemy, the pain was never your punishment, and the mirror was never your judge. They were all teachers pointing you home. The unconscious didn't seek to destroy you, it sought to complete you. The light and dark, the broken and the whole, now breathe together as one rhythm. And as you meet your reflection for the first time without fear, something sacred stirs behind your eyes. In the reflection, he didn't see a face. He saw a soul learning to love its own scars. That's the moment the mirror fulfills its purpose. Not to show you who you were, but to reveal who you're becoming. Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And now you understand. To see yourself clearly is to finally exist fully. Seeing yourself is the beginning of being. If this message spoke to you, take a breath, place a hand over your heart, and comment below. I choose to see myself without fear,